Welcome to Café Tales. I'm Alie, your host for today's mystery. Tonight, we join the brilliant detective Nero Wolfe and his sharp-witted assistant, Archie Goodwin, in the Room 9 sentence. This story will chill you to the bone as the seemingly natural deaths at a historic inn reveal a centuries-old vendetta that refuses to die. What begins with a desperate reporter's final note spirals into a deadly game where history itself becomes the executioner. Before we begin, I'd love to know, have you ever stayed somewhere that felt haunted by the past? Let me know in the comments. Now dim the lights, silence your phone, and prepare to be drawn into a mystery where Room 9 becomes judge, jury, and executioner for sins committed generations ago. The Room 9 sentence. Chapter 1. A Matter of Rooms and Doom. I had just finished typing up the Brannigan report, detailing how Mr. Wolfe had solved the case by spotting a discrepancy in the timing of a telephone call, when the doorbell rang. It was Tuesday morning, 10:45, and Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms with Theodore, fussing over the new batch of cattle yaws that had arrived the previous day. I put the cover on my typewriter, walked to the front door, and pulled it open. Standing there was a young woman of about 26 with dark brown hair cut in one of those practical but stylish bobs that newspaper women seem to favor. She wore a well-tailored gray suit that had seen better days but still held its shape respectably. "Archie. Goodwin?" she asked with a kind of directness that told me she already knew the answer. "In the flesh," I acknowledged. "And you are?" "Ellen Vance, New York Gazette." She produced a press card from her handbag and held it up briefly. "I need to see Nero Wolfe. It's urgent." "Mr. Wolfe doesn't see anyone without an appointment," I informed her. "And between 9 and 11, he's with his orchids, which means he wouldn't see the President of the United States if he showed up unannounced." "This is about multiple deaths," she said, not budging. 4 people have died after staying in the same hotel room. My editor's brother was one of them. That got my attention, but I maintained my professional stance. "Mr. Wolfe will be available at 11 nigh. You can wait in the front room if you'd like." She stepped inside, and I led her to the front room, where she declined my offer of refreshment. I returned to the office, made a note of her arrival in the log, and went back to my typing. At precisely 11:02, I heard the elevator machinery whir to life, bringing Wolfe down from the plant rooms. After giving him the customary 3 minutes to get settled at his desk, I entered his office through the connecting door. He was already leaning back in his custom-built chair, which was the only one in New York that could comfortably support his 1/7 of a ton. "There's a Miss Ellen Vance waiting to see you," I said. "Newspaper reporter. Says there have been multiple deaths at some hotel, all in the same room. Her editor's brother was one of the victims." Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly, which for him constituted a dramatic reaction. "A newspaper reporter," he said, his tone making it sound like I'd announced a visit from a particularly virulent strain of influenza. "No." She mentioned a substantial retainer. He closed his eyes for a moment, then sighed. "Very well. You may bring her in." I fetched Miss Vance and established her in the red leather chair facing Wolfe's desk. She looked small in it, but composed, with a reporter's notebook clutched in one hand. "Miss Vance," Wolfe began, "Mr. Goodwin tells me you wish to consult me regarding multiple fatalities. Please be concise." She didn't waste time. 4 people have died in the past 8 months after staying in Room 9 at Gallows Inn, a small establishment, about 2 hours north of the city. My editor's brother, Richard Palmer, was the 3rd victim. All deaths were ruled as natural: 2 heart failures, 1 stroke, and 1 aneurysm. Wolfe's eyelids drooped to half-mast. "I fail to see why this requires my attention," People do die, Miss Vance, often of natural causes. My editor didn't believe it was coincidence. Neither did his brother, apparently. She removed a folded paper from her purse. Richard left these notes in his jacket pocket. We only found them after the funeral. I took the paper from her and placed it on Wolfe's desk. He didn't touch it, but leaned forward slightly to read. The handwriting was jagged and hurried. Something wrong in room 9. Keep seeing things at the edge of vision, feeling watched by the past. The mirror isn't right. History has eyes here. Need to check county records about hangings on this property. His heart gave out that night, Miss Vance continued. He was 34 and had no history of cardiac issues. Interesting, Wolfe murmured, which from him was tantamount to wild enthusiasm. You mentioned a retainer. She reached into her handbag and produced an envelope. $500. My editor authorized it. He wants answers. That got Wolfe's full attention. $500 would keep the Orchids fed and Fritz's kitchen stocked for quite some time. He nodded to me and I took the envelope. Very well, Miss Vance, I will consider your case. Please provide Mr. Goodwin with all relevant details, names of the deceased, dates of their stays, any connections between them, and full particulars about this establishment. I assume you have already begun investigating? Yes. She opened her notebook. I've interviewed the inn staff and the local police. I've also requested the autopsy reports, though I don't have them yet. She hesitated briefly. I've booked a room at the inn, room 9. I'm staying there tonight. Wolfe's eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch. I would strongly advise against that course of action, Miss Vance. I'm a reporter, Mr. Wolfe. I need to experience the room myself. You need to remain alive. Cancel your reservation. She smiled thinly. I'll be fine. I don't have any family history of heart problems. She glanced at her watch. I should go if I want to check in before dark. I'll return tomorrow at noon to discuss my findings. Wolfe sighed. As you wish. Mr. Goodwin will collect your information before you depart. I spent the next 20 minutes taking down all the particulars from Miss Vance, including addresses, dates, and contact information for the families of the deceased. She was thorough. I'll give her that. When we finished, I escorted her to the E door. Be careful up there, I told her. Maybe sleep with the lights on. I've covered wars, Mr. Goodwin, she replied with a hint of amusement. I think I can handle one night in a creaky old inn. The next day, at noon sharp, I was reviewing Ellen Vance's information when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting to hear her voice explaining she was running late. Instead, a gruff male voice identified himself as Sheriff Donovan from Ulster County. You, Archie Goodwin, working for Nero Wolfe? That's right. We found your name and number in the effects of a woman who died at Gallows Inn last night. Ellen Vance, apparent heart failure. I felt something cold slide down my spine. What room was she in? Though I already knew the answer, hearing him say room 9 turned the cold feeling to ice. When I told Wolfe 10 minutes later, after getting all the details I could from the sheriff, his only response was to push the button for beer, but the look in his eyes told me that Ellen Vance's $500 had just purchased far more than she'd bargained for. It had bought Nero Wolfe's undivided attention. Chapter 2. The Hanging History. Wolfe was not pleased. The death of a client, especially one who had paid a retainer, offended his professional pride. It also meant complications, police, paperwork, and potentially leaving the brownstone. 3 things he abhorred with approximately equal intensity. You will go to this establishment immediately, he instructed me after his second beer. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. and he had spent the interval between Ellen Vance's death notification and lunch in silent contemplation. The retainer obligates us to investigate, and I dislike unfinished business. You're sending me to stay in the room where 4 people have died? I inquired, not entirely enthusiastic about the assignment. Of course not, Wolfe replied, his tone suggesting I had proposed something preposterous. You will not stay in room 9. You will merely investigate it thoroughly. Take the Heron. The Heron was our name for the sedan I normally drove when brownstone. Business required wheels. I had it outside the garage within 15 minutes, a small overnight bag beside me on the passenger seat. Before departing, I telephoned Sheriff Donovan to inform him I would be arriving that afternoon, representing Nero Wolfe in the matter of Ellen Vance's death. He sounded less than thrilled. The drive to Ulster County took slightly over 2 hours, with the last 30 minutes on winding country roads that hadn't seen fresh pavement since Herbert Hoover was promising prosperity. Gallows Inn appeared around a sharp bend, a 3-story clapboard structure with peeling white paint and black shutters that might have been charming 50 years earlier, but now just looked tired. A weathered sign creaked on rusted chains above, the entrance. The lobby smelled of furniture polish and mildew in equal measures. At the reception desk, a thin woman with gray hair pulled into a severe bun glanced up from her ledger. "Checking in?" she asked, her voice matching her appearance, dry and brittle. Information, actually. I placed one of my cards on the counter. Archie Goodwin, representing Nero Wolfe. I understand you had an unfortunate incident last night. The newspaper woman, she said. Yes. Very sad. Heart trouble, the doctor said. Miss Vance was consulting with Mr. Wolfe before her death. I'd like to speak with the management. That would be Mr. Harker. He's not here today. She didn't volunteer. When he might return. And who am I speaking with now? Mrs. Pembroke. I handle the front desk and bookkeeping. She tapped my card with a pencil. Sheriff Donovan has already been through everything. Not sure what else there is to say. I'd like to speak with the caretaker. Something flickered across Mrs. Pembroke's face. Annoyance, perhaps, or concern. Martin's. Busy with repairs. Always something to fix in a place this old. I'm sure he can spare a few minutes. Where might I find him? She hesitated, then sighed. Try the boiler room. Basement stairs are through that door. She nodded toward a faded green door beside the check-in desk. The basement was exactly what you'd expect in a building of this vintage. Stone foundation, walls, exposed pipes, and the pervasive smell of coal dust and dampness. I located the boiler room by following the sound of metal clanking against metal. Martin Frost didn't look up when I entered. He was a man in his 70s with gnarled hands and a face like weathered leather, working on some ancient piece of the heating system. Mr. Frost, I said. He turned, regarding me with pale blue eyes that seemed too sharp for a man his age. Who's asking? I introduced myself and explained my purpose. Unlike Mrs. Pembroke, Frost seemed almost eager to talk. 4 deaths in 8 months, all in room 9, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Don't need to be a detective to know something ain't right about that. Tell me about the room. Frost's expression darkened. Bad history in that part of the building. This whole place was built in 1892, but room 9 sits over the spot where they used to conduct the hangings, public executions. This was the county. Seat back then. Gallows stood right where the east wing is now. He gestured vaguely upward. Room 9 has the window that looks out where they used to do the deed. Some folks say you can still hear the trapdoor drop on quiet nights. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Mind showing me the room? Frost shrugged. Follow me. Not much to see now. Sheriff had the county boys go through it this morning. We climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was narrow with faded floral wallpaper and uneven floorboards that creaked with every step. Room 9 was at the end of the corridor, facing east. Frost produced a master key and unlocked the door. The room was small, with sloped ceilings and a single window that indeed looked out over what was now a bare patch of ground between the inn and a stand of oak trees. A four-poster bed dominated the space, with a washstand, dresser, and writing desk completing the furnishings. An old mirror in a tarnished brass frame hung on the wall opposite the bed. "Miss Vance was found there," Frost said, nodding toward the bed. "Maid came in around 8 this morning. Thought she was sleeping at first." I examined the room carefully, noting the ancient radiator beneath the window, the worn carpet, and the peculiar placement of the mirror, positioned so that anyone lying in bed would be reflected in it. Looking closer at the heating system, I noticed something odd: custom modifications to the old pipes, newer than the rest of the fixtures. "Has the heating system been updated recently?" Frost's expression didn't change. "Patched where needed. Old building, old pipes." I moved to the mirror, studying its positioning and the wall behind it. Something about the placement seemed deliberate. When I tapped the wall, the sound suggested a hollow space. "Interesting mirror," I commented. "Been here since before my time," Frost replied, watching me closely. Folks were more particular about seeing themselves back then. As evening approached, the room took on a different character. Shadows lengthened, and the fading light cast odd patterns through the window. Standing there, I could understand how someone might feel watched. The room had that quality of spaces that have witnessed too much. I spent another hour examining the inn's guest register, noting the dates when the victims had stayed. After arranging to interview the local doctor, who had pronounced Ellen Vance dead, I checked into room 12, as far from room 9 as the layout permitted, and called Wolfe at the prescribed time of 7 p.m., just before his dinner. "The inn was built on the site of public hangings," I told him, keeping my voice low. "Room 9 overlooks where the gallows stood. I found modifications to the heating system that don't match the rest of the plumbing, and there's something odd about the wall behind the mirror. I'm staying overnight to continue investigating tomorrow." "Very well," Wolfe replied. "Be thorough." After hanging up, I went to the local diner for a meal that made me appreciate Fritz's cooking even more than usual, then returned to examine county newspaper archives. The helpful librarian had allowed me to borrow them. Near midnight, as I was about to turn in, I found it: a yellowed clipping from 1887 about the hanging of 5 men for the murder of a prominent judge's daughter. The article questioned whether justice had been served, suggesting the evidence had been circumstantial at best. What caught my attention was the list of the condemned men's surnames: Vance, Palmer, Griffith, and Winters, matching the surnames of 3 of the recent victims. The 5th man's name was Harper. I was still contemplating this discovery when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that paused outside my door. The floorboard creaked once, twice, then silence. I reached for my gun, but before I could retrieve it from the nightstand drawer, something slid under my door, a small piece of paper. On it, written in a shaky hand: "Leave now. You sleep where they died." Chapter 3: Family Matters. I was back in the brownstone by 2 the following afternoon, having driven from Ulster County at a pace that would have earned Inspector Kramer's disapproval. The note under my door had been followed by a night of creaking floorboards and what sounded like whispers in the hallway. Probably nothing more than an old building settling, but combined with the newspaper clipping, it had been enough to keep me alert until dawn. Wolfe was at his desk when I entered the office, a book open before him, but his eyes closed. That meant he was thinking, not napping. I dropped my overnight bag by my desk and sat. I typed up my report on the drive back, I said, tapping the folder I'd placed on the desk. Short version: 4 victims in 8 months, all staying in room 9, all apparently dying of natural causes, but all with surnames matching men who were hanged at that location in 1887. Wolfe opened his eyes. A peculiar coincidence. One I don't believe in, I replied. Ellen Vance was different. Not a descendant, but a reporter looking into the deaths. I found modifications to the heating system in room 9, and the mirror placement is odd, positioned to reflect the bed perfectly. Wolfe's right index finger tapped once on his desk, his equivalent of dramatic emphasis. You confirm the surnames of all victims match those of the hanged men? 3 out of 4, Vance, Palmer, and Griffith. The 4th victim was named Winters, which also appears in the article. The 5th man hanged was named Harper, and as far as I know, no Harper has checked into room 9 yet. The genealogical connection requires verification, Wolfe declared, and we need the historical context of these executions. He pressed the button on his desk 3 times. Our code for Saul Panzer, the best of the freelance operatives, Wolfe, employed when cases required more legwork than I could handle alone. Until Saul arrives, you will research these executions, Wolfe instructed. The New York Public Library should have records of significant criminal cases from that period. I spent the next hour on the telephone calling the library and several historical societies arranging for materials to be pulled for review. At 4, Saul arrived, a small, unimpressive-looking man, unless you noticed his eyes, which missed nothing. Good afternoon, Saul, Wolfe greeted him, returning from his afternoon session with the Orchids. A job requiring your particular talents. Saul took the red leather chair, listening as Wolfe outlined what we knew and what we needed. Comprehensive, ownership records of Gallows Inn, background on all staff members, and most crucially, verification of familial connections between the victims and the men executed in 1887. I'll start with county records, Saul said. Land transfers, building permits, the works. For the genealogy, I'll need access to court documents from the trial. The trial occurred in Ulster County, I added. The judge was Hamilton Blackwood. Wolfe nodded. Begin immediately. Report daily at 9 p.m. After Saul departed, I prepared to visit the library, but the doorbell interrupted my exit. I checked the peephole and saw a familiar, unwelcome face, Inspector Kramer of Homicide West, his inevitable unlit cigar clenched between his teeth. I admitted him with my usual charm. Inspector, what a pleasant surprise. And here I thought it was Thursday, not Christmas. Kramer ignored me, as was his habit when he wanted to conserve energy for confronting Wolfe. I led him to the office where Wolfe was reading. Mr. Kramer, Wolfe acknowledged, marking his place with a finger. To what do I owe this intrusion? Kramer removed the cigar from his mouth. Ellen Vance, reporter, died yesterday upstate. Your name and number were in her notebook, along with a notation about a $500 retainer. Indeed, Wolfe replied. Miss Vance consulted me regarding suspicious deaths at an establishment called Gallows Inn. She became a victim herself before our investigation could proceed. What kind of suspicious deaths? Kramer demanded. 4 individuals expiring of apparently natural causes after staying in the same room. Miss Vance suspected foul play. And now she's dead. Kramer leaned forward. What's your interest, Wolfe? Heart attacks don't usually require your services. My interest is proportional to my retainer, Wolfe replied. Miss Vance paid for my attention, and now circumstances have reinforced her concerns. Mr. Goodwin has already visited the establishment in question. That got Kramer's attention. He turned to me. Find anything? Nothing conclusive, I answered truthfully, if not completely. The inn has a colorful history. Kramer wasn't satisfied, but he knew pushing wouldn't get him anywhere. The Stir County sheriff called me as a courtesy. 4 natural deaths don't make a murder case. Perhaps not, Wolfe conceded, but 4 natural deaths to individuals with a shared historical connection. I could see Kramer was intrigued despite himself. What connection? We are exploring that question, Wolfe responded. When we have answers, I will determine whether they merit your attention. Kramer stood, recognizing Wolfe's tone as the end of productive conversation. Don't withhold evidence of a crime, Wolfe. That's obstruction. I would never dream of it, Inspector. After showing Kramer out, I headed to the library, where I spent 3 hours examining archives of the Ulster County Gazette from 1887. The story that emerged was troubling. 5 men convicted of murdering Rebecca Blackwood, daughter of Judge Hamilton Blackwood, on circumstantial evidence. Public sentiment had been divided, with many believing the men, all laborers from immigrant families, had been convenient scapegoats. A petition for clemency had been denied. By the time I returned to the brownstone, Fritz was preparing dinner. The aroma of his cassoulet filled the house, momentarily displacing thoughts of old injustice and modern retribution. At 9 p.m. sharp, Saul called with his preliminary findings. I put him on speaker for Wolfe's benefit. Records confirm Richard Palmer was the great-grandson of Thomas Palmer, one of the men executed in 1887, Saul reported. James Griffith was the great-great-grandson of Michael Griffith, another of the condemned. Harold Winters is the grandson of John Winters, the 3rd man. Ellen Vance has no relation to Edward Vance that I can find. Different family entirely. The inn? Wolfe inquired. Originally built by Hamilton Blackwood after his retirement from the bench, Saul continued. Stayed in his family until 1947, then changed hands several times. Current owner is William Harker, purchased it 8 years ago. The caretaker, Martin Frost, has been there since 1962. Interesting note, Saul added. Frost's grandfather, George Frost, led the petition for clemency for the condemned men. Most illuminating, Wolfe commented. Continue your inquiries, Saul. After hanging up, Wolfe lapsed into silence, his eyes half closed in contemplation. Finally, he spoke. We are dealing with revenge, Archie, a calculated campaign of retribution spanning generations. But the deaths appear natural, I pointed out. Appearances can be engineered, Wolfe replied. The modifications you observe to the heating system suggest a method, gas perhaps, or some chemical agent introduced through the ventilation. The telephone rang before I could respond. I answered, and a thin, nervous voice spoke. This is William Harker, owner of Gallows Inn. Is this Nero Wolfe's office? Archie Goodwin speaking, I confirmed. Someone broke into our records room last night, Harker said. The only thing disturbed was the guest register, specifically the pages showing room 9 reservations. I glanced at Wolfe, who had raised an eyebrow a fraction of an inch. Do you have a security system, Mr. Harker? Just Martin, our caretaker. He swears he didn't hear anything. We'll look into it, I assured him. There's something else, Harker added, his voice dropping. Room 9 has been reserved for tomorrow night. The name in the book is Archie Goodwin. I felt a distinct chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. Someone knew I'd been investigating and was sending a message. I didn't make that reservation, I said carefully. I know, Harker replied. It was made by telephone yesterday evening. A woman's voice. She paid in advance. Said you'd be arriving after dinner. Chapter 4. A View to a Killing. Wolfe was not pleased by the news of my phantom reservation. His lips tightened into a thin line, which was as close as he generally came to visible alarm. Clearly, he said after a moment's consideration, someone wishes to establish whether our interest in these deaths is professional or merely curious. By inviting me to sleep in the death room, I suggested not the most subtle approach, but potentially effective. Wolfe pressed the button on his desk twice, our signal for Fred Durkin, another of our occasional operatives. Less cerebral than Saul, but dependable and solid. Fred will observe the inn tonight and tomorrow. You will visit the surviving victim, Harold Winters. His survival may provide insights. And my reservation at the inn? You will not be keeping it, Wolfe stated, flatly. I have no interest in testing whether you share some obscure genetic connection to Edward Vance. By 9 the next morning, I was on my way to Greenwich Village, where Harold Winters had an apartment. Fred had reported in, confirming he was positioned in a rooming house across from Gallows Inn, with a clear view of the entrance and room 9's window. Winters lived in a third-floor walk-up that had seen better decades. He answered my knock with the caution of a man who had recently faced mortality, opening the door just enough to reveal a thin face with sunken eyes and 3 days' worth of stubble. Mr. Winters, I said, offering my card through the gap. Archie, Goodwin, representing Nero Wolfe. I'd like to ask about your stay at Gallows Inn. He examined the card, then me, with equal suspicion. The detective. What's your interest? 4 people have died after staying in room 9. You checked out early and survived. That makes you unique. The door opened wider. Winters was in his 60s, with the stooped posture of a lifelong academic and hands that trembled slightly. His apartment reflected his profession, books on every surface and papers stacked with a system comprehensible only to their owner. I left after one night, he said, gesturing me to a chair that required relocating a stack of academic journals. Something felt wrong. Wrong how? Winters settled into an armchair that had conformed to his shape over years. I'm a professor of history, retired now. I was at the inn researching local records on 19th century judicial practices. Room 9 was the only one available. He paused, collecting his thoughts. That night I felt observed, not in the usual sense. It was as if the room itself was watching. The mirror? I suggested. His head snapped up. Yes. How did you know? Just an observation. Please continue. I woke around 2 announced in the morning, feeling strangely lethargic, and the moonlight was hitting the mirror, and I could have sworn I saw movement in it. Someone watching from the other side. He gave a self-deprecating smile. Ridiculous, of course. But in that moment I was certain. I got up, examined the mirror, found nothing unusual. But I couldn't shake the feeling. So I checked out the next morning. I told them I'd received an urgent call. 2 days later, at home, I collapsed. Doctor said it was a mild stroke, though I've never had hypertension or other risk factors. Did you notice anything unusual about the room? The heating system, perhaps? Winters considered. Now that you mention it, the room was unusually warm despite the cool evening, and there was a faint odor, something chemical beneath the usual mustiness of old buildings. Like cleaning fluid? No, more medicinal. I assumed it was the inn's Ancient plumbing. He leaned forward. Why these questions? Do you think something in that room caused my stroke? It's a possibility we're exploring, I replied, keeping it vague. One more question. Are you aware of any family connection to Ulster County, particularly to events in 1887? His expression shifted from confusion to sharp interest. How could you possibly know about that? My grandfather rarely spoke of it. John Winters, one of 5 men executed for murder. Great-grandfather, he corrected. The family changed the spelling. From Winterstein after the incident. They believed the trial was rigged. The judge's daughter was murdered, and the judge himself presided over the case. The evidence was circumstantial at best. I was scribbling notes. Did you mention this connection to anyone at the inn? Good God, no. The family considered it shameful, though I've always found it historically fascinating. That's actually why I was researching judicial practices of the period, working on a paper about judicial conflicts of interest, using the case as an example. I thanked Winters for his time and headed back to the brownstone, my mind assembling pieces of the puzzle. Someone was systematically luring descendants of the executed men to Room 9 and somehow inducing fatal natural causes. Ellen Vance had stumbled onto the pattern through her editor's brother. Now I had an eyewitness account of the method. Something in the room that caused drowsiness and eventually a fatal health crisis. Wolfe was in the plant rooms when I returned, communing with his orchids until the afternoon session ended. I typed up my notes and placed them on his desk for his return. At 4:30, the phone rang. It was Fred Durkin. Archie, he said, his voice low. Someone's in room 9 right now. Older man, gray hair, entered about 20 minutes ago with cleaning supplies. He's been moving around the room, doing something to the wall near the mirror. Martin. Frost, I said, the caretaker. Keep watching. If he leaves the inn, follow him. We will, Fred replied. One more thing. There's a car parked down the road. Been there since morning. A man inside, watching the inn. I'm not the only one keeping tabs on this place. I relayed this information to Wolfe when he came down from the plant rooms. He absorbed it while settling his 1/7 of a ton into his custom chair, then pressed the button for beer. After Fritz had delivered it and retreated, Wolfe spoke. The scenario becomes clearer. Professor Winters survived because he left before receiving a lethal dose of whatever agent is being administered. The mirror likely conceals an observation point. The caretaker's movements suggest maintenance of the delivery mechanism. But why? I asked. Revenge for a 137-year-old injustice. Justice delayed is a powerful motivator, Wolfe replied, particularly if reinforced through generations of family narrative. The doorbell interrupted our discussion. Fritz appeared moments later, carrying a small package. Special delivery for Mr. Wolfe, he announced. I signed for it. The package was about 6 inches square, wrapped in brown paper with Wolfe's name and address typed on a label. No return address. Fritz set it carefully on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe examined it without touching it further. Open it. Archie. Cautiously. I used my pocket knife to carefully slit the paper, then eased off the lid of the box inside. Nestled in crumpled newspaper was a hand-carved wooden miniature, a perfect replica of a gallows with 5 tiny figures hanging. From nooses. The craftsmanship was exquisite and disturbing. Beneath it lay a folded note on yellowed paper. Lifted the note with the tip of my knife and unfolded it. The message, written in a flowing script that somehow suggested antiquity, read, Justice comes to those who denied it. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I knew him well enough to recognize the intensity in his eyes. He had been presented with a challenge, and nothing motivated Nero Wolfe more than direct provocation. "The wood," he said after studying the miniature. "Eastern white pine, hand-carved with traditional tools. The technique is consistent with folk art of the late 19th century. The style would be informative to an expert." I thought of the wooden paneling at Gallows Inn, the intricate banister on the main staircase, also hand-carved, also pine. "Martin Frost," I suggested, "the old caretaker. He's been at the inn for decades. His grandfather protested the hangings." "Perhaps," Wolfe acknowledged, "but delivering this to our door suggests a different level of involvement than mere maintenance. Our adversary is now aware of our investigation and is responding directly." The telephone rang. I answered to hear Fred's voice, tense and hurried. "Archie, police just arrived at the inn. 3 patrol cars and an ambulance. They're bringing someone out on a stretcher from room 9. Chapter 5. The Executioner's Song. The miniature gallows sat on Wolfe's desk like an accusation. He had been studying it for nearly an hour, using a magnifying glass to examine the fine details of the carving. I had called Fred back and instructed him to remain at his post and report any developments. "The craftsmanship is distinctive," Wolfe declared finally. "This was carved by someone with years of experience using techniques that have largely fallen out of practice." "Like Martin Frost's age would suggest," I offered. "Indeed," Wolfe set the magnifying glass down. "The question is whether these deaths represent vigilante justice or something more complex. The timing is peculiar. Why now, after so many decades?" "Maybe something triggered it," I suggested. "An anniversary, perhaps. Or the appearance of the victims in Ulster County." Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly. "Professor Winters mentioned researching the case. His presence may have catalyzed existing resentments." The telephone rang. It was Saul reporting in earlier than scheduled. I put him on speaker. "I've completed the genealogical research," he said. "All the victims except Ellen Vance had direct ancestral connections to the jury or judicial participants in the 1887 trial. Richard Palmer's great-grandfather was the prosecutor. James Griffith's great-grandfather was the jury foreman. And Professor Winters wasn't entirely forthcoming with you, Archie. His ancestor wasn't one of the executed men. John Winters was the court clerk who allegedly altered testimony records. The plot thickens," I remarked. "I also found something about Martin Frost," Saul continued. "His grandfather, George Frost, didn't just petition for clemency. He was arrested multiple times for threatening the judge and was eventually committed to an asylum where he died. The family maintained the men were innocent for generations." "Most illuminating," Wolfe commented. "And the ownership of the inn?" "Current owner William Harker bought it from the estate of Margaret Blackwood, the judge's great-granddaughter," Saul replied. "The inn has been renovated several times, most recently 8 years ago when Harker took over. Martin Frost has been the caretaker for over 40 years, originally hired by the Blackwood family." "Intriguing," Wolfe murmured. "The caretaker has maintained his position through multiple ownership changes." "One more thing," Saul added. "I found a recent article about Ellen Vance. She was working on a book about historical injustices in the New York legal system. The Blackwood case was going to be her centerpiece." After Saul hung up, Wolfe sat in silence for several minutes, his eyes closed, his fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin. Finally, he pressed the button for beer. While we waited for Fritz to deliver it, the doorbell rang. I went to answer it, checking the peephole first. Inspector Kramer stood on the stoop, looking even more dour than usual. I admitted him with my customary grace. Another social call, Inspector. You'll give people the wrong idea. Kramer ignored the pleasantry. Where's Wolfe? I led him to the office where Wolfe was just receiving his beer from Fritz. The miniature gallows was no longer on the desk. I had returned it to its box and placed it in the safe earlier. Mr. Kramer, Wolfe acknowledged. Twice in as many days. I'm flattered by your attention. Cut the comedy, Kramer growled, settling his bulk into the red leather chair. Another death. At that inn upstate, Edward Harper, history professor from Columbia, found dead in room 9 an hour ago. I felt a chill. Harper, the 5th surname from the hanging article. The circle was now complete. Apparent cause? Wolfe inquired, sipping his beer. Heart failure, preliminarily. Man was 62, seemingly healthy. Kramer's eyes fixed on Wolfe. Olter? County sheriff called me directly, said your man Durkin has been watching the place since yesterday. A precaution, Wolfe replied smoothly, given the pattern of deaths. What pattern? Kramer demanded. 4 people die naturally, and suddenly, Nero Wolfe is interested enough to put a man on surveillance? 5 people, I corrected, including Ellen Vance, our client. And now a 6th, Kramer added. Care to share what you know, or should I start checking for obstruction charges? Wolfe sighed, as if the mere suggestion of criminal charges wearied him beyond measure. I am investigating a pattern of deaths that appear natural but may be induced. All victims, save Miss Vance, have ancestral connections to a controversial trial in 1887, where 5 men were hanged for a murder they likely did not commit. History? Kramer said incredulously. You're saying someone's killing people over a 137-year-old court case? Justice delayed is still sought by some, Wolfe replied. The descendants of those executed have maintained their innocence through generations. The victims are all descendants of those who secured the conviction. The prosecutor, jury foreman, court clerk, and now, presumably, others involved in the case. Kramer's expression suggested he wasn't sure whether to believe Wolfe or have him committed. And how are these natural deaths being arranged? That remains unclear, Wolfe admitted, though Mr. Goodwin observed modifications to the room's heating system that might facilitate the introduction of a substance. The sole survivor, Professor Winters, reported unusual drowsiness and a medicinal odor. I expected Kramer to explode, but he surprised me by sitting back and considering Wolfe's words. You realize how this sounds? Implausible, but not impossible, Wolfe replied. The evidence is circumstantial but accumulating. Like that trial in 1887, I added. After Kramer departed, with a warning that felt more perfunctory than usual, Wolfe and I discussed our next steps. The death of Edward Harper, completing the cycle of namesakes, suggested either coincidence, beyond statistical probability, or a meticulous plan nearing completion. We need to examine that room thoroughly, I said. Whatever mechanism is being used must be sophisticated enough to leave no obvious trace, yet simple enough for one person to operate undetected. And who is that person? Wolfe mused. Martin Frost remains the obvious suspect given his family history, woodworking skills, and access to the inn. Yet delivering the miniature here suggests a level of mobility at odds with a full-time caretaker's duties. The phone rang again. It was Fred Durkin, speaking in the hushed tone he used when in public. Archie, I followed the county coroner's men when they removed the body. When I got back, I saw Martin Frost leaving the inn with a suitcase. He's gone, disappeared, down a side road on foot. And that car I mentioned, still there, but now it's empty. Stay at your post, I instructed. Saul will meet you in an hour. I'm on my way up there now. Wolfe, who had heard Fred's report on the speaker, raised an eyebrow a fraction of an inch, his version of alarm. "You will not go alone, Archie. Saul will be there," I reminded him. "And if Frost is running, we need to move quickly." Wolfe's lips compressed slightly, but he nodded. "Very well. But exercise extreme caution. Our adversary has demonstrated both patience and lethal competence." I arrived at Gallows Inn just after sunset, the old building looking particularly sinister in the fading light. Yellow police tape crossed the entrance to room 9, but the rest of the inn was operating normally, or as normally as an establishment. With 6 recent deaths, could manage. Mrs. Pembroke was at the reception desk, her pinched expression suggesting the day's events had done nothing to improve her disposition. "Mr. Goodwin," she acknowledged, "frosty. Back again." "I understand, Martin." "Frost has left," I said, dispensing with pleasantries. A flicker of something, worry, fear, crossed her face. "Yes," said he needed to visit his sister in Albany, very sudden. "Did he leave a forwarding address?" "No, just said he'd be back in a few days." I doubted that very much. A man who had waited decades for revenge wouldn't abandon his post unless something had forced his hand. I met Saul outside, and together we examined the exterior of the inn, particularly the area beneath room 9's window. Behind a decorative trellis, we found something interesting, a small external access panel that connected to the room's heating system. Fred joined us, reporting that the police had departed but were expected to return in the morning. "The guest register," I said suddenly. "We need to see who's scheduled for room 9 next." The 3 of us returned to the reception desk, where Mrs. Pembroke was closing out the day's accounts. "We need to see the reservation book," I told her with more authority than I technically possessed. She hesitated, then slid the heavy leather-bound register across the counter. I flipped to the current week, running my finger down to room 9's entries. The most recent had been Edward Harper. The next name, scheduled for the following night, sent a jolt through me. There, written in flowing script that matched the note with "The Gallows," was a name I recognized immediately. Nero Wolfe. Chapter 6. A Night at the Inn. I stared at Wolfe's name in the reservation book, my mind racing through implications. Someone was either trying to lure Wolfe from his brownstone sanctuary, near impossible feat, or sending another message. Either way, it represented an escalation. "Problem?" Mrs. Pembroke asked, her thin voice cutting through my thoughts. "When was this reservation made?" I tapped Wolfe's name in the book. She adjusted her glasses and peered at the entry. "Yesterday afternoon. Telephone booking. Paid in. Advance with a money order that arrived this morning." That aligned with when I discovered the connection between the victims and the historical case. I thanked her with more courtesy than she deserved and rejoined Saul and Fred outside. "Someone's made a reservation for Wolfe," I informed them quietly. "Tomorrow night, room 9. Saul's eyebrows rose slightly. For him, an expression of profound surprise. He wouldn't. "Of course not," I interrupted. "But someone expects either him or me to show up." "A trap?" "Indisputably," Saul agreed. "Question is, do we spring it under controlled conditions or avoid it entirely?" I checked my watch. Nearly 8. "Let's examine the room first. I need to call Wolfe at 9. Using the master key I had acquired during my previous visit, through methods I won't detail, we entered room 9. The space felt charged with a history of death, though nothing visibly suggested anything sinister. The bed was freshly made, the surfaces dusted. All evidence of Edward Harper's demise had been efficiently removed. Saul, Methodical as always, began a systematic inspection, starting with the heating vents. Fred kept watch at the door. I focused on the mirror, which Professor Winters had found. So disturbing. The glass was old, with the slight waviness of hand-poured manufacture. The frame, tarnished brass, was securely mounted to the wall. I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling for irregularities, and found a small catch on the bottom, right corner. When pressed, it allowed the mirror to swing outward like a door, revealing a shallow compartment behind. "Saul," I called softly. He joined me, examining the hidden space. Inside was a small shelf holding what appeared to be a modified fumigation device, a metal canister connected to a timer and a flexible tube that led into the ventilation system. "Clever," Saul murmured. "Set the timer, close the mirror, and wait. When activated, it would release whatever's inside directly into the room's air circulation, but not affect other rooms," I added, seeing how the tube connected to a separate duct. "Someone's modified the ventilation to isolate room 9. The canister was empty, likely removed and replaced between victims. We found no fingerprints. Not that I expected any from someone this methodical. The viewing angle is perfect," Saul noted, looking through the two-way mirror toward the bed. "You could observe the entire process without being seen." A disturbing thought, but consistent with the evidence. I called Wolfe precisely at 9 using the inn's telephone booth in the lobby. "The reservation is a provocation," Wolfe concluded after hearing my report. "Our adversary grows impatient or concerned with our progress." "What's the play?" I asked. "I could check in under your name, see who's watching." There was a pause that stretched several seconds too long. I knew Wolfe was weighing my safety against the need to resolve the case. "You will not use my name, nor will you stay in room 9. You may, however, create the impression that you intend to. Arrange with Saul to occupy the adjacent room, disable the device if it is replaced, monitor who approaches the room during the night. And if it's Martin Frost, apprehend him for questioning. But I suspect our solution may not be so straightforward," Wolfe replied. "The craftsmanship of the gallows suggests a lifelong dedication to both woodworking and vengeance. Consider who else might have such skills with a connection to the historical events." After ending the call, I outlined the plan to Saul and Fred. Saul would take room 7, adjacent to 9. Fred would maintain external surveillance. I would make it appear that I intended to stay in room 9, but would actually hide in Saul's room after creating the impression I had retired for the night. We executed the plan methodically. I checked into room 9 under my own name, explaining to Mrs. Pembroke that Mr. Wolfe had sent me in his stead due to pressing business. Her sour expression suggested she found this entirely unremarkable. I made a show of bringing my overnight bag to room 9, turning on lights and ordering dinner from the small restaurant downstairs. After the meal was delivered, Saul and I carefully disabled the timing mechanism on the fumigation device, leaving the canister itself untouched, in case someone checked it. We found it had been recently replaced, the metal still cooling from handling. "Nitrogen compound would be my guess," Saul said, sniffing carefully near, but not directly at, the canister's seal. "Triggers cardiac events when inhaled over. Several hours. Nearly impossible to detect in an autopsy unless specifically looking for it." At 11, I turned off the lights in room 9, made noise suggesting bedtime preparations, then slipped quietly to Saul's room. We positioned ourselves to observe both the corridor through a cracked door and room 9 through a connecting vent that provided a limited view of the mirror. The hours crept by. Midnight passed, then 1, with no activity beyond the occasional creaking of the old building settling. At 2:17, we heard soft footsteps in the corridor. too soft for the ancient floorboards, suggesting someone who knew exactly where to step to minimize noise. A shadow passed our doorway, pausing briefly outside, room 9. The handle turned slowly, and the door opened with practiced silence. In the dim emergency lighting of the hallway, I glimpsed a figure entering. Not Martin Frost's stooped form, but someone slighter, moving with purpose. Saul and I exchanged glances. This wasn't according to script. We had expected either Frost or possibly an accomplice checking the device, not someone entering the supposedly occupied room. I reached for my gun, nodding to Saul to cover the hall while I approached the connecting vent for a better view. Through the narrow opening, I could see a figure standing motionless by the foot of the bed, as if observing the shape created by strategically arranged pillows under the covers. The stillness was unnerving, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. Then, with surprising swiftness, the figure moved to the mirror, opened the hidden compartment, and checked the device. Finding it disabled, they stiffened. At that precise moment, every light in the inn went out, plunging the building into absolute darkness. The emergency generators should have activated immediately. They didn't. I heard rapid movement from room 9, then the door opening. I moved to intercept, colliding with Saul in the pitch blackness. "Power's been cut," he whispered unnecessarily. We fumbled to the hallway, using the wall as a guide. I could hear footsteps moving rapidly away, but pursuing in the darkness was an invitation to injury or worse. "They're heading for the stairs," Saul murmured. A sudden flare of light appeared at the far end of the corridor, a match or lighter. In its brief illumination, I caught a glimpse of a face, not Martin Frost, but a woman I recognized from the lobby earlier that day. She had been reading a newspaper, unremarkable enough that I had barely noted her presence. "The bookkeeper," I whispered to Saul. The match disappeared, leaving us in darkness again. Gradually, my eyes adjusted enough to discern shapes. I was about to suggest we pursue when I heard another sound, footsteps approaching from the opposite direction. These were heavier, less cautious. Saul and I pressed ourselves against the wall, waiting. The footsteps came closer, accompanied by the beam of a flashlight sweeping the corridor. "Hello?" called a voice I didn't recognize. "Is anyone there? The power's out in the whole building." "Stay here," I told Saul. "Cover the stairs, I'll deal with this." I stepped into the flashlight's beam, identifying myself as a guest. The man holding it introduced himself as the night manager, explaining he was checking on guests. I asked about the emergency generator. "Should have kicked in automatically," he said, clearly frustrated. "Someone must have disabled it. First that poor professor dies here, and now this. Place is falling apart." While he rambled, I noticed something on the floor glinting in the flashlight beam. A small key. I casually shifted position to place my foot over it, continuing the conversation until the manager moved on to check other rooms. I retrieved the key, old-fashioned, heavy brass with a tag attached. Room 9. Not my key, which was still in my pocket, a duplicate. The light suddenly flickered back to life, accompanied by the belated hum of the generator. Saul rejoined me, reporting the stairs and exits were clear. Fred called from outside. He had seen someone exit through a service door and disappear into the woods behind the inn. Too quickly for pursuit in the darkness. We regrouped in room 9, examining the key I'd found. The tag bore not just the room number, but a name written in faded ink. Blackwood. "Interesting," Saul remarked. "A family heirloom, perhaps." I nodded, pocketing the key as evidence. Our female friend knew exactly when to cut the power. This wasn't improvised, and she recognized immediately that the device had been tampered with, Saul added, suggesting intimate knowledge of its operation. Not Martin Frost, then? Perhaps not working alone, Saul suggested. Dawn was breaking by the time we finished searching the rest of the inn, finding nothing further of note. The bookkeeper, Elizabeth Harper, according to Mrs. Pembroke's reluctant information, had not returned to her room. Her few belongings had been removed sometime during the night. Harper. The surname struck me with sudden clarity. The fifth man hanged in 1887 was named Harper, not an employee of the court, but one of the executed men. A connection Wolfe and I had missed, focusing too narrowly on the victim's lineage. As I drove back to New York, Saul following in his car, I considered the implications. Elizabeth Harper, descendant of a man unjustly hanged, working at the inn built on the execution site, patiently orchestrating elaborate revenge. The timing, the precision, the historical knowledge, all fit. But questions remained, particularly about Martin Frost's role and current whereabouts. I was still pondering these when I pulled up to the brownstone on 35th Street. Fritz opened the door before I could use my key, his expression grave. "Mr. Wolfe is waiting," he said. "Inspector Kramer called an hour ago. They found a body in Ulster County, an old man. The description matches Mr. Frost." Chapter 7. The Gathering. Wolfe was at his desk when I entered the office. A book opened before him, though I doubted he was reading it. His eyes followed me as I dropped into my chair, fatigue suddenly catching up with me after the night's events. "Martin Frost is dead?" I asked, though it wasn't really a question. "So it appears," Wolfe replied. "Found in the woods behind the inn, his throat cut. The preliminary report suggests he died yesterday afternoon, before our nighttime visitor. I note someone's tying up loose ends. I provided a complete account of the previous night's events, including the discovery of the mechanism behind the mirror, the power outage, and Elizabeth Harper's disappearance." Wolfe listened without interruption, his eyes half closed, the only movement the occasional lifting of his beer glass. "The surname is significant," he observed when I had finished. "Harper, connecting her to the final executed man. Not a coincidence." "No," I agreed, "but why kill Frost if he was her accomplice?" "Perhaps he had fulfilled his purpose," Wolfe suggested, "or become a liability. The modification of the inn's ventilation system would have required his expertise and access. Once completed, his continued existence presented a risk." "She's been planning this for years," I said. "Working at the inn, identifying descendants of the court officials, luring them to room 9. "Methodical," Wolfe agreed, "and now accelerating her timeline in response to our intervention." He pressed the buzzer 3 times for beer, then surprised me by following it with 4 more presses, our code for Theodore Horseman, the Orchid nurse, indicating Wolfe would be unavailable for the afternoon plant session. "A significant deviation from routine. We will gather all parties concerned at the brownstone," he announced. "Today at 4. "All parties?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "The killer is in the wind." Nevertheless, Wolfe's tone indicated the decision was final. "Contact William Harker, the inn's owner, Professor Winters, the Ster County Sheriff, Mrs. Pembroke, and any surviving relatives of the victims you can locate quickly." I stared at him. "You're hosting a gathering with a killer at large." "The most efficient method to resolve this case," Wolfe replied calmly. "Saul will continue seeking Miss Harper. You will arrange the gathering." I spent the next few hours on the telephone, extending invitations that ranged from surprised acceptance to skeptical questioning. By 3:30, I had confirmed attendance from William Harker, Professor Winters, James Griffith's widow, Richard Palmer's sister, Sheriff Donovan, and to my surprise, Mrs. Pembroke, who claimed she was already planning to come to the city on business. Inspector Kramer called at 3:45, having heard about the gathering through Sheriff Donovan. "What's Wolfe playing at?" he demanded. "Solving a multiple homicide," I replied. "Feel free to join us." "I'll be there," he growled. This better not be one of his theatrical stunts. At 4 sharp, Fritz began admitting our guests to the brownstone. Wolfe remained in the office, receiving them with minimal courtesy, as I made introductions. Professor Winters arrived first, followed by Sheriff Donovan, a burly man with a perpetual squint, and then William Harker, the inn's owner, a nervous-looking man in his 50s with thinning hair and expensive clothes that didn't quite fit his frame. Mrs. Pembroke arrived with surprising punctuality, her pinched face even more severe in the daylight. The victim's relatives followed. Margaret Palmer, Richard's sister, a composed woman in her 40s, and Elaine Griffith, James's widow, still wearing visible grief 6 months after his death. Kramer arrived last, positioning himself by the door with the air of a man expecting trouble. The room was crowded, with extra chairs brought in from the dining room to accommodate everyone. The atmosphere was tense, each person eyeing the others with varying degrees of suspicion. At precisely 4:30, Wolfe cleared his throat. The low conversation ceased immediately. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice measured. "We are here to discuss a series of deaths connected by history and deliberate design." He outlined the case methodically. The deaths in Room 9, the historical connection to the 1887 trial, the mechanism discovered behind the mirror. Several gasps punctuated his narrative, particularly from William Harker, who seemed genuinely shocked by the modifications to his property. "This was a calculated campaign of revenge," Wolfe continued, "executed over months, perhaps years, targeting descendants of those involved in a miscarriage of justice nearly a century and a half ago." "You're saying these weren't natural deaths?" Sheriff Donovan interrupted, leaning forward in his chair. "They were engineered to appear natural," Wolfe corrected. "A compound administered through the ventilation system while the victim slept, triggering fatal cardiac events, the dosage carefully calibrated, the delivery system designed for precise control." "But who would do such a thing?" Margaret Palmer asked, her voice strained. "And why now, after all this time?" "A descendant of one of the executed men," Wolfe replied. "Someone with both motive and opportunity, someone with access to the inn and knowledge of its history." All eyes turned to William Harker, who raised his hands defensively. "I've only owned the place for 8 years. I had no idea about any of this history until Mr. Goodwin started asking questions." "Martin Frost knew," Mrs. Pembroke interjected. "His family had been talking about that trial for generations, wouldn't shut up about it." "Indeed," Wolfe acknowledged. "Mr. Frost was involved, but not as the architect of this revenge, rather as an accomplice whose knowledge of the building made the scheme possible." "And now he's dead too," Sheriff Donovan added grimly. "Eliminated once his usefulness ended," Wolfe confirmed. The true orchestrator needed to ensure his silence. "Elizabeth Harper," I supplied, "the bookkeeper who disappeared last night." Mrs. Pembroke's eyes widened slightly. "Elizabeth?" "Impossible. She's worked at the inn for 7 years, keeps to herself, handles the accounts. Nothing remarkable about her." "On the contrary," Wolfe replied, "her unremarkable nature was cultivated precisely to avoid scrutiny while she identified targets and arranged their stays in Room 9. "Harper," Professor Winters said suddenly. "One of the executed men was named Harper." "The last one hanged," Wolfe confirmed. "His great-granddaughter, raised on stories of injustice, dedicated her life to avenging that perceived wrong. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. Fritz appeared a moment later, his expression concerned. "A visitor, sir, says he urgently needs to speak with you regarding Gallows Inn." "Name?" Wolfe inquired. "Martin Frost, sir." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Sheriff Donovan was on his feet instantly. "Impossible," he snapped. "Frost's body is in the county morgue. I identified him myself this morning." Fritz looked apologetic but firm. "Nevertheless, sir, he insists he is Martin Frost." Wolfe nodded once. "Show him in." The man who entered bore a striking resemblance to the Martin Frost I had met at the inn. The same weathered face, the same arthritic hands, but he moved with slightly more vigor, his eyes clearer. "You're investigating the deaths at the inn," he stated, not a question. "I've been in hiding for 3 weeks. Someone's been impersonating me, using my name, my position. I only learned about the deaths when I saw a newspaper yesterday." Sheriff Donovan looked like he might explode. "Who the hell is in my morgue, then?" Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I knew him well enough to recognize intense interest. "When did you last work at the inn, Mr. Frost?" 3 weeks ago, the old man replied. "I received a letter saying my sister in Buffalo was ill. When I arrived, she was fine. Never sent any letter. By the time I realized something was wrong and returned, someone else was there, calling himself Martin Frost. Mrs. Pembroke claimed I'd never left, acted like I was crazy. I'd been watching the place from a distance, trying to figure out what was happening." All eyes turned to Mrs. Pembroke, whose expression had transformed from pinched disapproval to barely controlled panic. "This man is clearly disturbed," she said, her voice higher than before. "Martin has worked at the inn continuously. I would know if he'd been replaced by an imposter." "Would you, Mrs. Pembroke?" Wolfe asked mildly. "Or should I address you as Mrs. Harper?" The room fell silent. Mrs. Pembroke's face went through a remarkable series of transformations, settling finally into a cold mask of dignity. Before she could respond, the lights in the brownstone suddenly went out. The spring afternoon was overcast. Leaving the room in near darkness, I heard movement, a gasp, then the sound of something or someone falling. "Nobody move," I called, reaching for the small flashlight I keep in my desk drawer. The beam illuminated a tableau of frozen figures and one collapsed form on the floor near Wolfe's desk. Professor Winters had slumped from his chair, his face ashen. In the confusion of the next few moments, Kramer barking orders, someone screaming, Fritz hurrying to check the electrical panel, I almost missed the most significant detail. Mrs. Pembroke was no longer in the room. The emergency lighting activated with a hum, casting the office in a dim glow. Dr. Vollmer, our neighbor and frequent medical consultant, was summoned and arrived within minutes. His preliminary examination of Professor Winters suggested a mild sedative rather than anything life-threatening. "He'll be fine," Vollmer announced. "Appears to be chloral hydrate from the symptoms. Relatively small dose." The only person near his drink was Mrs. Pembroke, I noted, who was conveniently disappeared. "Find her," Wolfe instructed, as calm as if he were ordering dinner. "She will not have gone far." Kramer was already on the telephone, calling for officers to search the area. I headed for the front door, knowing that in the confusion she had only a few minutes' head start. I spotted her half a block away, walking briskly toward 10th Avenue. Not running, that would attract attention, but moving with clear purpose. I followed, maintaining distance, watching as she hailed a taxi at the corner. I memorized the cab number and returned to the brownstone, where Kramer had officers ready to intercept the taxi's destination. But as I provided the details, a disturbing thought struck me. Mrs. Pembroke, or Mrs. Harper, hadn't seemed surprised by the power outage, almost as if she had expected it, almost as if it had been planned. "The brownstone's electrical system," I said suddenly. "We need to check it now." Fritz and I hurried to the basement where the main electrical panel was located. The brief outage had apparently been caused by a tripped circuit breaker, but closer inspection revealed something more sinister. Attached to the panel, a small device with a timer set to cut power to the entire house. And beneath it, inscribed in the same flowing script as the note with the gallows, a message: "Justice comes in many forms." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. The real target had never been Professor Winters. It had been Nero Wolfe himself. Chapter 8. Room for Justice. The taxi carrying Mrs. Pembroke, or rather Elizabeth Harper, was intercepted at Grand Central Station. She had purchased a ticket to Chicago, the first step in what was undoubtedly a carefully planned disappearance. Kramer's men brought her back to the brownstone, where she sat in the red leather chair, her posture rigid with dignity, her eyes cold and unrepentant. The gathering had thinned somewhat. Professor Winters had been taken to his apartment with Dr. Vollmer attending him. The victim's relatives had been sent home with police protection in case Harper had accomplices. The remaining audience consisted of Kramer, Sheriff Donovan, William Harker, the real Martin Frost, Saul Panzer, who had returned in time for the denouement, and myself. Wolfe, having consumed 2 bottles of beer in quick succession, studied Harper with the detached interest he might give to a particularly unusual orchid specimen. "Your performance was remarkable," he told her. 7 years establishing your identity as the innocuous Mrs. Pembroke, constructing a revenge scenario of considerable complexity, executing it with patience and precision. She regarded him without expression. "I have nothing to say." "Nevertheless, I shall speak," Wolfe replied. "Your great-grandfather, Thomas Harper, was executed in 1887 for a murder he did not commit. The real killer was never identified. The trial was a travesty. The verdict was predetermined by Judge Hamilton Blackwood, whose daughter was the victim." A flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or vindication, crossed her face. "Your family maintained his innocence through generations," Wolfe continued. "You were raised on stories of injustice. At some point, these stories became purpose. You obtained employment at Gallows Inn, built on the site of the execution, owned for decades by the Blackwood family. A symbolic choice. Is this a confession?" "You're writing for me, Mr. Wolfe?" she asked, her voice steady. "It is an explanation," Wolfe corrected, "for those present who deserve to understand what has transpired. You identified descendants of those responsible for the wrongful executions, the prosecutor's great-grandson, the jury foreman's great-grandson, the court clerk's grandson, and today, your ultimate target, myself." This earned a raised eyebrow from her. "You? You're not connected to the case." "Indeed not," Wolfe agreed. "But I had become an obstacle to your final act of vengeance, the one you had carefully saved for last. Judge Hamilton Blackwood's great-great-grandson, William Harker." All eyes turned to Harker, who had gone deathly pale. "That's absurd," he stammered. "My grandmother's maiden name was Blackwood." "Yes, but I had no idea about any of this. I bought the inn as an investment property 8 years ago." "Precisely. When Mrs. Harper began establishing her position there," Wolfe noted. "Not coincidental. You purchased your family's historical property without recognizing its significance. She recognized both the property and you. Harper's composure finally cracked, a bitter smile transforming her face. His family erased their connection to the judge after the scandal, changed their name from Blackwood to Harker, buried the truth, just like they buried those 5 innocent men. While you executed your revenge methodically, Wolfe said, ensuring each victim stayed in room 9, using your position to tamper with the reservations and room assignments, utilizing the modified delivery system Mr. Frost unwittingly helped install, believing it was an improvement to the heating. Martin Frost looked stricken. I had no idea the ventilation upgrades were Mr. Harker's project when he took over. I just did what I was told. Precisely, Wolfe agreed. And when Mr. Goodwin began investigating, you recognized the threat. You arranged for the real Mr. Frost to be called away, replaced him with an imposter, likely your accomplice, who could monitor the investigation while maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed. The man in the morgue, Sheriff Donovan interjected. The imposter, Wolfe addressed Harper directly. When his usefulness ended, you eliminated him too. Harper's expression revealed nothing, but her silence was confirmation enough. Ellen Vance discovered the pattern, Wolfe continued. Her research into historical injustices led her to the Blackwood case and the recent deaths. She recognized what you were doing. So she became your next victim, a deviation from your ancestral revenge, but a necessary one to protect your plan. She was going to publish, Harper said suddenly, her voice flat. Turn it all into a sensationalist story. Profit from my family's suffering. Cheapen everything. And when Mr. Goodwin continued her investigation, you attempted to eliminate him as well, Wolfe noted. When that failed, you became more direct, sending the miniature gallows, making the reservation in my name, accelerating your timeline. You would have stopped me before I finished, she said, the first hint of emotion coloring her words. Before justice was complete. Justice? Kramer interrupted, unable to contain himself any longer. You murdered 5 people for something that happened more than a century ago. 5 innocent men were hanged, Harper shot back, her eyes flashing. Their families destroyed, their names ruined. The judge knew they were innocent. His own daughters. Lover was the real killer, but he couldn't bear the scandal. Easier to hang 5 immigrant laborers. And how do you know this? Wolfe inquired. My great-grandmother saved everything, Harper replied. Letters, diary entries, a confession from the real killer that Judge Blackwood suppressed. Evidence passed down through generations. My family spent decades trying to clear their names through proper channels. Petitions for posthumous pardons, appeals for judicial review, all denied or ignored. So you appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner. I delivered the sentence. That was generations overdue. Wolfe sighed, the small sound somehow conveying profound weariness with human nature. The tragedy compounds itself. 5 innocent men died in 1887. You responded by killing 5 more innocent people whose only crime was their ancestry. The cycle of injustice continues, merely with different victims. For the first time, Harper's certainty seemed to waver. They benefited from the lie. Inherited positions, money, social standing, all built on my family's destruction. Perhaps, Wolfe said aloud, but they did not commit the original crime. They were as innocent as your great-grandfather. The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled. Even Kramer, usually quick with a retort, seemed to recognize the gravity of the moment. I have one question, Archie said finally, his voice unsteady. Was I next? Was I supposed to die in room 9 too? Harper's eyes met his directly. You had a reservation for next week. The room was being prepared for you. Kramer had heard enough. He nodded to the officers waiting by the door, who moved forward to take Harper into custody. She rose with dignity, offering her wrists for the handcuffs. The court will be the same, she said to no one in particular. The system will protect its own. Nothing has changed. That remains to be seen, Wolfe replied. The evidence your family preserved may yet serve justice, though not in the manner you chose. After the others had departed, Kramer to process Harper's arrest, Harker and Frost to return to the inn with Sheriff Donovan, Saul to his own devices, Wolfe, and I remained in the office. The afternoon had shifted to evening, and Fritz was preparing dinner. A satisfactory conclusion, Wolfe declared, though his tone suggested something less than complete satisfaction. Justice delayed is justice denied, I remarked, recalling his earlier words. But I'm not sure her version was justice at all. Indeed, Wolfe's finger tapped once on his desk. An interesting legal and moral question. Harper's family was genuinely wronged. Their century-long pursuit of official remedy was genuinely unsuccessful. At what point does the system's failure justify taking justice into one's own hands? I don't think it ever does, I replied. At least not by killing innocent people. A reasonable position, Wolfe agreed. And yet throughout history, societies have repeatedly failed to correct their own injustices until forced by circumstances or conscience. The gong sounded, announcing dinner. Wolfe rose from his chair with the surprising grace he always displayed despite his bulk. The case was closed. The routine of the brownstone would resume, and tomorrow there would be orchids to tend and other clients to consider. As we moved to the dining room, I reflected on the intersection of past and present, of historical wrongs and modern vengeance. 5. Men had died in 1887. Their innocence never acknowledged. 5 more had died in our time, their only crime being their ancestry. And somewhere between these deaths lay the question of justice, what it meant, what it cost, and whether it could ever truly heal the wounds of the past. Fritz had prepared duck with orange sauce, asparagus with hollandaise, and a charlotte royale that would have made a French pastry chef weep with envy. The food was excellent, the beer was cold, and Wolfe was in a philosophical mood. By unspoken agreement, we avoided further discussion of the case. Some questions have no satisfactory answers, and even Nero Wolfe, with all his genius, couldn't solve the paradox of justice delayed and justice denied. The brownstone on West 35th Street stood solid and unchanging, a fortress against the chaos of human passions. Tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new challenges. But tonight, in the familiar ritual of an exceptional meal, there was at least the comfort of order restored, however imperfectly, to a world where the past never truly dies. Thanks for joining us for the Room 9 sentence. Did you suspect Elizabeth Harper was masquerading as Mrs. Pembroke before? Wolfe exposed her as the architect of this generational revenge. Were you moved by the moral complexity? A family wronged by history seeking justice through equally unjust means? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this case with Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, hit subscribe. More mysteries arrive daily. Until next time, remember Wolfe's observation. Justice delayed is a powerful motivator, particularly if reinforced through generations of family narrative. This is Alie, signing off from Café Tales.